On January 7, 1945, the bloodiest American engagement of the Second World War was finally drawing to a close in the frozen Ardennes. But a deeply dangerous crisis was detonating, not from German panzers, but from a microphone inside a British headquarters in Belgium. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood before the press and framed a brutal, desperate American struggle as a chaotic mess that he had personally swept in to tidy up. In a matter of hours, a single public relations speech pushed top American generals to the absolute brink of mutiny against the unified command. The survival of the Anglo-American coalition was suddenly in jeopardy, just months before the planned final assault into the heart of Germany. What unfolded in the following days was not a clash of armies, but a high-wire act of military diplomacy orchestrated by U.S. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall. From his office in Washington, Marshall had to navigate a toxic fallout that was rapidly spinning out of control. The British press, eagerly consuming Montgomery's carefully tailored narrative, was already printing headlines that painted the American defense as a disorganized rout saved only by British intervention. In Europe, American field commanders were deeply insulted, watching the agonizing sacrifices of their troops be publicly marginalized. Their bruised egos and shattered trust threatened to completely paralyze Supreme Headquarters. Marshall understood that if this narrative was allowed to stand, the internal command structure could permanently fracture. He needed to secure the rightful recognition for the American soldiers who had actually bled to halt the German offensive. But the diplomatic trap was exquisitely dangerous. How could Marshall compel the British government to publicly correct their most celebrated general and rewrite the established media narrative without triggering a catastrophic, open political war between the Allies? To understand how Supreme Headquarters arrived at the edge of a command collapse, we have to look back 3 weeks to the sheer physical chaos of December 16, 1944, when 3 German armies crashed through the frozen, misty forests of the Ardennes. They achieved total tactical surprise. But they achieved something else equally dangerous, a massive geographical wedge driven straight through the center of the American lines. As the German panzer columns pushed deeper toward the Meuse River, they effectively sliced the Allied front in two. This created an immediate, desperate crisis of command and control. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American 12th Army Group, was headquartered in Luxembourg City on the southern flank of the expanding Bulge. But 2 of his entire armies, General Courtney Hodges' 1st Army and General William Simpson's 9th Army, were now isolated on the northern shoulder. Between Bradley and his northern commanders lay a chaotic void of advancing German armor, severed telephone cables, and heavily jammed radio frequencies. Winter storms grounded courier planes. Bradley simply could not physically reach or effectively communicate with a massive portion of his own forces. The battle was moving too fast, the weather was too severe, and the logistical tether had snapped. On December 20th, sitting in the map room at Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, General Dwight D. Eisenhower recognized this geographic reality. The northern shoulder needed unified command, and it needed it immediately. Someone had to coordinate the American defense on that side, allocate reserves, and prepare a counterattack. Just north of the American line sat the British 21st Army Group, commanded by Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. His communication lines to Hodges and Simpson were intact, secure, and clear of the German advance. Driven by pure logistical necessity, Eisenhower made a temporary emergency adjustment. He stripped command of the American 1st and 9th Armies away from Bradley and handed operational control directly to Montgomery. On paper, it was a sound, undeniable tactical decision. In the cold mathematics of war, geographic proximity dictated command. But wars are fought by human beings, and in the tense, highly politicized atmosphere of the Allied coalition, this temporary transfer of power landed like a bombshell. To the American officer corps, the decision was a profound psychological blow. Since the Normandy landing 6 months earlier, the Americans had been supplying the vast majority of the manpower, the armor, and logistical muscle for the campaign in northwest Europe. They had fought their way across France and were grinding against the German border. Now, in their darkest hour, facing the heaviest German counteroffensive of the war, the optics suggested that American generals were incapable of managing their own crisis. Bradley was furious, viewing the transfer as a deeply personal vote of no confidence. Hodges, already exhausted and overwhelmed at First Army headquarters, felt sidelined. The American officers on the ground were dealing with brutal conditions, infantrymen freezing in foxholes, fighting desperate holding actions at places like Elsenborn Ridge and St. Vite, dying by the thousands to stabilize the lines. They were defensive, sleep-deprived, and acutely sensitive to any implication that they had failed. They did not want to be rescued. They certainly did not want to be rescued by the British, and least of all, by Montgomery. Montgomery possessed a brilliant analytical military mind, but he was completely devoid of diplomatic tact. He was meticulously cautious, toweringly self-assured, and fundamentally convinced of his own tactical superiority over his American counterparts. When Eisenhower handed him the Northern Command, Montgomery did not approach his new American subordinates as a supportive partner in a shared crisis. Instead, he arrived at Hodges' headquarters projecting the air of a strict headmaster stepping in to discipline an unruly classroom. A staff officer famously observed that the Field Marshal strode into the First Army command post like Christ coming to cleanse the temple. Montgomery immediately began issuing orders to tidy up the defensive lines, pulling back American units from exposed positions. Decisions that, while militarily prudent, felt like humiliating retreats to the aggressive American commanders. He was deliberate, unhurried, and entirely blind to the raw, exposed nerves of the officers around him. He treated the American armies as chaotic instruments that simply needed his steady, methodical hand to function properly. For 2 agonizing weeks, the Americans on the northern shoulder bit their tongues and took Montgomery's orders. They absorbed the German blows, stabilized the front, and slowly began to push back in the freezing snow. They bled heavily to seal the breach. The crisis was contained not by a sudden stroke of British tactical genius, but by the sheer, stubborn attrition of American infantry and armor holding the line. By the first week of January, the German offensive was functionally broken. The Americans felt they had survived the crucible through their own immense sacrifice. They were exhausted, but their pride was intact. They were ready to reclaim their armies and their narrative. But Montgomery, viewing the stabilized map, saw something entirely different. He saw a chaotic American disaster that he had personally, methodically brought under control. He believed he was the architect of the salvation. And so, with a battle largely decided, Montgomery decided it was time to explain exactly how he had saved the day. When he stepped to the microphone at his headquarters to address the Allied press, his incredibly patronizing language hit the American command structure at its absolute most vulnerable moment, lighting a fuse that was bound to reach the powder keg. The transcripts of Montgomery's January 7th press conference reached American headquarters like a mortar strike. Standing before the reporters, the Field Marshal had spoken of the battle as a disjointed American effort that required him to step in, gather the scattered pieces, and personally balance the front. He described the desperate, bloody American defense with a phrase that would instantly become infamous, claiming he had simply tidied up the battlefield. The British press, starved for good news and naturally inclined to elevate their own hero, seized the narrative immediately. Fleet Street ran sensational headlines echoing Montgomery's tone. To a casual reader in London, it appeared that the entire American military apparatus had collapsed in the snow, only to be rescued from total annihilation by the steady brilliance of the British Empire. When those newspapers reached the continent, the American command structure detonated. For General Omar Bradley, this was not just a diplomatic blunder, it was a profound professional humiliation and an insult to the thousands of American soldiers who had frozen and bled to hold the line. Bradley had already felt undermined by the temporary shift in command, but Montgomery's public boasting was the absolute limit. Incandescent with rage, Bradley bypassed normal diplomatic channels and delivered a blunt, uncompromising ultimatum to Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. If Eisenhower intended to make the current command structure permanent, keeping American armies subordinated to Montgomery for the final drive into Germany, Bradley would resign his commission. He explicitly stated that he would rather walk away and ask to be sent home than serve under the field marshal for one more day. Bradley was not bluffing, and he was not standing alone. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army had executed a brutal 90-degree pivot in the snow to break the siege of Bastogne, immediately backed his colleague. Patton made it clear that if Bradley walked out, he would follow. Simultaneously, the American press caught wind of the British headlines. Furious editorials began rolling off printing presses in New York and Washington. A temporary, tactical battlefield decision had mutated into a deeply toxic nationalistic feud playing out in global newspapers. The unified Anglo-American command, the very foundation of the Allied war effort, was suddenly facing total paralysis. Eisenhower was cornered. He could not afford to lose Bradley and Patton, the primary architects of the American ground war. But he also could not publicly rebuke Montgomery without triggering a catastrophic political rupture with Winston Churchill and the British public, just as the Allies desperately needed to organize the final, massive push across the Rhine. Trapped between a rebellious, furious American staff and an unyielding, triumphant British media narrative, Eisenhower's authority alone was no longer enough to contain the fallout. The crisis had outgrown the battlefield. To save the coalition from tearing itself apart, the Supreme Commander desperately needed an intervention from someone operating on an entirely different plane of power. That higher plane of power resided across the Atlantic, behind the closed doors of the newly constructed Pentagon in Washington, D.C. General George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, was not a battlefield tactician. He was the primary architect of the entire global American military machine. Marshall was a man of famously austere temperament, possessing a cold, calculating intellect that commanded absolute reverence from both American politicians and British high commanders. As the encrypted cables from Supreme Headquarters began spilling onto his desk in the second week of January 1945, Marshall did not read them as a collection of bruised egos. He read them as an existential threat to the structural integrity of the Allied war effort. Marshall recognized instantly that Eisenhower was fundamentally trapped. The Supreme Commander was too close to the blast radius, too deeply entangled in the daily politics of the coalition to forcefully discipline a British national hero without sparking a command revolt. If Eisenhower pushed Montgomery too hard, London would rebel. If he didn't push hard enough, Bradley and Patton would resign. The local crisis had breached its containment. It required a geopolitical solution, and Marshall immediately took the reins, shifting the battlefield from the frozen forest of Belgium to the encrypted transatlantic telegraph cables connecting Washington and London. Marshall began by initiating a series of urgent, highly classified back-channel communications with the British Joint Staff Mission in Washington. He bypassed the public theater of the press completely, dealing directly with the highest echelons of the British military establishment. Marshall's strategy was not to complain about Montgomery's lack of manners. In the brutal calculus of global war, hurt feelings were irrelevant. Instead, Marshall framed the press conference as a catastrophic failure of strategic messaging that was actively jeopardizing the lifeblood of the alliance, the support of the American public. He coldly reminded his British counterparts that the entire Allied strategy in Europe was underwritten by American industrial logistics, American Lend-Lease shipments, and, most importantly, the willingness of American parents to send their sons to die on another continent. If the newspapers in New York and Chicago continued to run front-page stories suggesting that British generals were condescendingly taking credit for American blood, The domestic backlash in the United States would be uncontrollable. The isolationist wing of the American Congress was always waiting for an excuse to demand a shift of resources away from Europe and toward the Pacific theater. Marshal made it perfectly clear to the British High Command. Montgomery's ego was no longer just an annoyance for Eisenhower. It was threatening to sever the logistical and political arteries of the entire European campaign. But just as Marshal was tightening the diplomatic screws on London, the crisis radically escalated, weaponized by an enemy that was listening to every word. Deep inside the collapsing Third Reich, the monitoring stations of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had intercepted the BBC broadcasts of Montgomery's press conference. German intelligence officers, desperate for any leverage to slow the Allied advance, realized immediately that they had been handed a psychological goldmine. They did not simply translate the Field Marshal's speech, they meticulously manipulated it. Working in Berlin recording studios, German audio technicians selectively edited the acetate tapes. They surgically removed Montgomery's few caveats and compliments, amplifying the most incredibly patronizing tones and stitching together the most arrogant, self-aggrandizing phrases into a condensed, highly concentrated audio track. They crafted a masterful piece of psychological warfare designed specifically to target the deepest insecurities and rawest nerves of the American officer corps. The Germans wasted no time deploying this new weapon. Within hours, powerful German shortwave and medium-wave radio transmitters, operating under the guise of Axis propaganda programs, began blasting the manipulated audio directly toward the front lines in the Ardennes. They broadcast on frequencies they knew were constantly monitored by Allied signal units, and bored infantrymen huddled around captured radios. The timing was devastating. In the freezing, snow-choked foxholes around shattered towns like Bastogne and Saint-Vite, exhausted, combat-traumatized American G is tuned in. These were men who had watched their friends get blown apart by German artillery, who had suffered through sub-zero temperatures without winter gear, and who had engaged in brutal, hand-to-hand combat to halt the SS Panzer divisions. Now, through the crackling static of the radio, they were forced to listen to a British field marshal seemingly dismissing their agonizing sacrifices as a tidy little cleanup operation orchestrated by his own genius. The psychological toll was immediate and highly toxic. Furious rumors began ripping through the American ranks. Trust in the unified command plummeted. The genuine physical threat of American combat units passively refusing to cooperate with British flanks or ignoring orders from British liaison officers became an imminent operational nightmare. Thousands of miles away, American signals intelligence intercepted these German broadcasts, and the transcripts were rushed directly to the Pentagon. When the files landed on George Marshall's desk, he saw the ultimate leverage he needed. Marshall did not just view the German propaganda as an insult. He weaponized it as absolute, undeniable proof of the danger Montgomery's speech posed to the war effort. Marshall bundled the intercepted German transcripts and forwarded them across the Atlantic to the British chiefs of staff. He systematically stripped away the British defense that this was merely a misunderstanding or a case of overly sensitive American generals. Marshall presented the intelligence as an active, unfolding security disaster. He delivered a chillingly clear message to London. Your leading field commander is actively generating ammunition for German psychological warfare. He is destroying frontline combat cohesion, and he is doing the enemy's work for them. It was a diplomatic strike of devastating precision, shifting the burden of the crisis entirely onto the shoulders of the British government. London could no longer dismiss the issue as a petty squabble over press clippings. It was now a documented vulnerability actively being exploited by the Third Reich. To completely seal the trap, Marshall followed up this intelligence with a weapon far heavier than words: the raw, unassailable arithmetic of the battlefield. He forced the British leadership to look directly at the ledger of human cost. Operating with the cold efficiency of a chief of staff, Marshal compiled the exact real-time casualty statistics from the Ardennes counteroffensive and presented them to the British War Cabinet. The numbers were staggering, and the disparity was absolute. Marshal detailed how nearly 30 American divisions, comprising over 600,000 men, had been thrown into the meat grinder of the Bulge. He laid out the grim reality that American casualties, the dead, the wounded, the missing, and the captured, were rapidly approaching 80,000 men. Then, he placed those figures directly next to the British contribution to the battle. While British forces had played a vital role in securing the Meuse River bridges and providing reserve depth, their physical engagement in the primary combat zones was minimal by comparison. British casualties in the Ardennes stood at roughly 1,400 men. The mathematical ratio of American to British blood spilled to halt the German offensive was nearly 60-1. By forcing the British government to officially acknowledge these statistics in the context of the global media narrative, Marshal utterly dismantled any lingering British illusion that Montgomery's version of events was acceptable. He cornered the leadership in London with undeniable facts. The British government realized with a sudden, cold clarity that they were standing on a diplomatic precipice. If Marshal decided to release these exact casualty figures to the furious American press, accompanied by the transcripts of the German propaganda broadcasts, the resulting political explosion would shatter the Anglo-American alliance permanently. London was trapped. They had to execute immediate, massive damage control to save the coalition. They had to publicly recalibrate the narrative, validate the staggering American sacrifice, and completely walk back the narrative established by their own celebrated general. Marshal had successfully cornered the British leadership with facts, but he had also created a delicate political paradox. Who actually possessed the sheer political gravity, the oratorical skill, and the global authority to openly contradict a national hero like Bernard Montgomery, rewrite the international headlines, and appease the furious American command structure without making it look like a humiliating, forced apology from the British Empire? The answer, Marshal knew, could not come from anyone wearing a uniform. If Eisenhower attempted to publicly discipline Montgomery, the British press would instantly frame it as an arrogant American supreme commander bullying a British war hero, and the outrage in London would only multiply. If Marshal himself demanded a formal retraction through military channels, it would look like a hostile ultimatum from Washington, exposing the deepest fractures of the unified command to the entire world. In the rigid hierarchy of the Allied coalition, fixing a public relations disaster of this magnitude required bypassing the military structure entirely. It required the ultimate political authority. Marshal's meticulously calculated pressure campaign had circumvented the generals and landed directly on the desk of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. For Churchill, this was an agonizing political trap. By January 1945, the British Empire was physically bankrupted, its manpower heavily depleted, and its global influence visibly eclipsed by the staggering industrial and military mass of the United States. Montgomery was more than just a field commander. He was the primary symbol of enduring British prestige, the living proof that the United Kingdom was still a co-equal superpower in the fight against fascism. For the Prime Minister to openly contradict his own most famous general was to swallow a bitter dose of national pride on a global stage. Yet, Churchill was a ruthless pragmatist. He stared at the intelligence files Marshal had forwarded. He absorbed the cold arithmetic of the 60-1 casualty ratio and read the transcripts of German radio operators actively turning Montgomery's hubris into a psychological wedge to shatter the Allied lines. The Prime Minister understood instantly that the survival of the Anglo-American coalition was vastly more important than the ego of one field marshal or the fleeting cheers of Fleet Street. Churchill realized he had absolutely no choice. He had to step into the highly public arena of the House of Commons and deliver a masterclass in political maneuvering. He was effectively forced into a corner where he alone had to extinguish the American fury, defuse the German propaganda machine, and rewrite the narrative of the entire battle, all without completely humiliating the British military establishment. On January 18, 1945, the Prime Minister stood before a packed House of Commons. He knew that the microphones capturing his voice were not just broadcasting to the British public, they were feeding directly into the War Department in Washington, the tense field command posts in Belgium, and the propaganda listening stations in Berlin. Churchill now had to deploy his most potent weapon, his towering mastery of political rhetoric, combined with the unvarnished mathematical truth George Marshall had forced onto his desk. He began by systematically dismantling the media illusion of a British rescue, addressing the sheer physical reality of the Ardennes. Speaking with calculated gravity, Churchill explicitly stated that the United States Army was doing the overwhelming bulk of the fighting. He did not merely compliment the American troops, he fundamentally recentered the entire narrative around their sacrifice. He made it absolutely clear to the world that it was American armor, American artillery, and American infantry that had absorbed the terrifying, concentrated weight of the German panzer divisions. Churchill carefully recalibrated Montgomery's role. He praised the Field Marshal's tactical management of the northern shoulder, but he strictly framed it as a localized, supporting effort within a profoundly American theater of operations. Then he delivered the definitive statement, the exact phrasing Marshall needed to stabilize the coalition. Churchill officially crowned the brutal winter campaign, declaring to the House of Commons that the Bulge was undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and predicting it would be remembered as an ever-famous American victory. He backed this soaring rhetoric with the cold statistics Marshall had provided, openly acknowledging the staggering casualty disparity. By publicly confirming that the Americans had suffered almost all the losses, Churchill executed a surgical, high-stakes political correction. This single speech neutralized Joseph Goebbels' manipulated radio broadcasts in an instant, stripping the German intelligence machine of its most toxic psychological weapon. Across the Atlantic, the American press immediately pivoted. The front pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post swiftly replaced the infuriating headlines of British arrogance with Churchill's resounding official tribute. Inside the Pentagon, Marshall's cold, calculated diplomatic gamble had worked flawlessly. In the European theater, Omar Bradley and George Patton stepped back from the edge of resignation. The unified command had been pulled back from the brink of total paralysis. Churchill's unprecedented address had successfully extinguished the immediate political fire, rewriting the international media narrative overnight. But as the ink dried on these new headlines, this forced, high-stakes diplomatic intervention left behind a deeper, far more uncomfortable question. What did this bitter, behind-the-scenes battle for public credit actually reveal about the true, underlying nature of the Allied victory? The immediate crisis, sparked by a single tone-deaf press conference, had been completely extinguished by prime ministerial decree. Churchill's forced intervention preserved the unified command structure just weeks before the Western Allies were scheduled to launch their massive, final invasions across the Rhine and into the German heartland. Had the command fractured, had Omar Bradley and George Patton actually walked away, the operational timeline for the destruction of the Third Reich would have been severely compromised. But the resolution of this January standoff strips away the heavily romanticized post-war myth of an effortless, perfectly harmonious Allied brotherhood. The victory in Europe was not secured by a monolithic, frictionless machine where generals linked arms in flawless solidarity. It was a brutal, pragmatic coalition, constantly boiling beneath the surface with nationalistic friction, professional jealousy, and towering personal egos. Montgomery's disastrous briefing and the subsequent transatlantic fallout proved that defeating the German military was only half the battle. The other half was the agonizing daily grind of simply keeping the alliance intact. The crisis demonstrated that the Anglo-American partnership was not held together merely by a shared hatred of fascism or a common democratic ideal. It was actively sustained by the strict, ruthless management of human volatility. It required leaders like George Marshall, operating far behind the lines in the Pentagon, who understood that a misplaced word in a briefing room could be just as devastating to the war effort as a severed supply line. Marshall treated diplomacy with the exact same cold, calculating discipline as a tactical envelopment. By forcing the British government to publicly swallow its pride and acknowledge the raw arithmetic of American sacrifice, he averted a catastrophic rupture. The alliance survived the winter of 1945, not because it was immune to internal conflict, but because its architects leveraged intelligence, statistics, and political ultimatums to force it to hold together. Ultimately, the absolute destruction of the Third Reich was not solely secured by the overwhelming weight of American industrial logistics, the relentless volume of artillery shells, or the tactical brilliance of commanders in the field. It was secured because the men running the war understood the highly fragile, deeply human mechanics of their own coalition. In the freezing winter of 1945, the march to victory in Europe was quietly saved by a general in Washington who knew exactly when to force a prime minister to publicly clean up the devastating diplomatic wreckage of his most famous field marshal.